Welcome to the Ruthless Criticism first ever live stream. Okay, I'm going to rely on chat to tell me how my audio sounds, if it sounds good, what the volume levels are like, is it too high, too low? Any feedback, much appreciated. Testing, 1, 2, anyone out there? Okay, we got it pretty good. I'll take that. I'll take that as better than what it could have been. Okay, so perfect minor buzzing. Okay. I don't know if that's a joke or levels are good. Okay. Okay, so what is this live stream about? Well, this live stream is a visual primer to Marx's value theory. And basically, the goal of this primer is to get you introduced to Marx's value theory. It is not to cover all aspects of Marx's value theory, nor is it to rebut all arguments against Marx's value theory. Obviously, that would be a much longer live stream with a lot more content involved. And not only am I not prepared for that, I'm pretty sure no one else here is either. So what we're going to be covering is basically probably the first several paragraphs of Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1, and we'll be covering topics like use value, exchange value, and value itself, what these things mean, how Marx understood them, what his sort of basis and reasoning for seeing them this way was, and then we will go into sort of developing this concept with a few different visual cues. So the visual cues are essentially going to be me using a whiteboard. So the basic principle here is that as I'm sort of explaining concepts, I'll be adding to this drawing. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll have a pretty good idea of what the hell Marx was talking about and why. With that said, let's just kind of begin. So we need to begin with Marx's premise that the capitalist mode of production, or capitalism more generally, presents itself really as a collection of commodities. For that, we need to kind of understand what a commodity is, and that's Marx's essential focus in the first chapter of the first volume of Capital. The commodity, according to Marx, it's obviously an object, but this object has certain properties or certain attributes, and he sees this in a twofold fashion. The first fashion is as a use value. The second fashion that he really talks about initially is as an exchange value, but as he later gets into, this is just an expression of what he calls the value of the commodity. Now, in general, what distinguishes a commodity from a non-commodity? We know non-commodities are traded. That is to say, we know things are traded in the market that don't really have the same properties of a commodity. So the main question is, what in general market speak is a commodity? And the primary aspect of a commodity is that it's fungible. Essentially, that one commodity is a sort of suitable replacement for another, and that these things can essentially be reproduced or produced in a certain quantity, and don't really have anything that's like completely unique. So for example, a Michelangelo painting is not a commodity. That term may be used loosely to apply to something like that, just as an item for exchange. However, it was not produced necessarily for exchange, and it's not something that's fungible in the sense that it could be easily reproduced and have more of these things made to be exchanged. So the fungibility aspect is fairly critical to the labor aspect of Marx's theory. But let's begin with at least, I guess we'll bust out the crayons at this point, because without the visual cues, this is probably way less interesting. So hopefully you guys will be able to see my whiteboard actions. And actually, let me just see if I can split my screen real quick here so that I can get a better view of two things at once. I just want to make sure that I can monitor chat. And if you guys have questions while we're going through this, I don't want to ignore them. Feel free to post your questions in the chat. However, if I don't respond to it immediately, or if I respond to it very briefly, please don't be too annoyed. just because, as I said, I don't really want to get into like rebutting every possible argument against things. And I did post this to Capitalism v. Socialism, so I suspect we have some liberals in the audience. I know we have at least one. Okay, so let's begin with what Marx calls really the capitalist system as a whole, which presents to us as a mass collection of commodities. We're going to create one commodity here. We're going to create another commodity. You know what, let's make it a little bit oblong in shape. Is that the word, oblong? Sure. And then we'll create our final commodity. That one's getting a little bit too big, it's going off the screen. Actually, I don't like that, I'm going to redo that one. Let's just make it smaller. Okay. So here's our collections of commodities. We don't really have any idea what these are. Doesn't really matter what they are. But in order to distinguish them from one another, aside from shape, we're going to add some additional attributes. So the first attribute, and really the only attribute that we're going to discuss to keep things simple, is their color. And I need to pick something non-overtly gay. Oh geez. Non-overtly gay for the last one. This assumes I can get my color selector. I have not practiced this in terms of drawing, so forgive me if I'm a little bit terrible. Okay, so we have the basic colors of our commodities, and then from there we will just we'll label them. We'll get a commodity A, commodity B, commodity C. This should be pretty clear. So this is our capitalist economy, and it's a collection of economies or commodities. So what Marx is talking about when he talks about use value is the qualitative aspects of these commodities. And when we talk about qualitative aspects, we're talking about properties that really can't be quantitatively compared. They can be in terms of magnitudes of their qualities. However, they can't be compared in terms of the qualities themselves. So for example, we can't really say, for example, that purple is equal to pink or pink is equal to orange. This doesn't really make a lot of sense unless we're importing this concept of subjective utility, which I'm going to conveniently avoid for now but get into later. We also can't say purple is better than pink or pink is better than orange. We generally have to question for what? For what is the commodity useful? And clearly these use values, as the commodity is first a use value, have to have some properties which correspond to the desires of the subject. So if you're hungry and commodity A happens to be a form of food, then commodity A is going to serve your hunger a lot better than commodity B or C, assuming that those are not food. So each color here, along with its size and shape generally, or not really its size, but its shape generally, we could consider a property of these commodities such that none of these can really be quantitatively compared. Now, we might say that given the size, we have different magnitudes, right? We have a certain quantity of purple, we have a certain quantity of pink, and we have a certain quantity of orange. But these things are still conditioned based on that qualitative aspect that we can't ignore. It doesn't say, it doesn't make any sense, like if we assign this guy a quantity of, let's say, 5, so that's 5 purple, this guy is, we'll say, 4 pink, and we'll say this guy is 2 orange. It doesn't particularly make a lot of sense to say that this is just 5 or this is just 4. It has to be 5 of something, 4 of something, and 2 of something. So this is the use value aspect of a commodity. It is wholly in the realm of subjects to determine what is useful for them. Marx does not make any comment regarding like that, you know, utility is some sort of objective fact, outside of the simple fact that there are certain properties that fulfill certain desires. And you could say that, you know, at least in the terms of like, I don't want to starve to death, like calorie count, for example, might be one of those properties. We then see that these commodities exchange for one another. So basically, what we're seeing in that exchange is that one commodity is being considered equal to another. And this at first seems a little bit strange because even though we observe exchanges in the market, we don't really think about qualities in terms of things that can be compared. So it's tough for me to say something like, can I compare objectively, outside of my subjective whims or desires, a screwdriver to a hammer? Again, we have to kind of ask, for what is this thing to be used? And then we get back into the subjective realm. Yet at the same time, we know that we can observe exchanges of certain amounts of quantities. And it doesn't matter what these amounts are. The only thing that matters essentially is that these are definite amounts, right? That in one instance, we definitely saw 5 purple exchange for 4 pink, or we definitely saw 4 pink exchange for 2 orange. It's this quantitative amounts of these qualitative aspects that leads Marx to then believe that there is something that's underlying these things. And it's not just that he believes it, it's that he knows it has to be true, because these commodities don't appear out of thin air. There's some actual basis for them to be in the market in the first place. There's some actual basis for them to actually be reproducible. If we took this set of commodities and these exchanges, we would have to realize that in order for this system to continue as is, in order for these specific relations of exchanges to occur as is, we would have to continually be reproducing certain quantities of A, certain quantities of B, and certain quantities of C. We wouldn't be able to change how much we produce and then assume that all these things are going to remain in the same equal proportions that they were in historic cases. This is no surprise generally to people who want to criticize Marx. They would call this basic idea supply and demand, right? So you would say that as the supply of a given quantity decreases, the price which people are willing to pay for it is basically going to go up, right? So there's a certain demand at a certain price given the constraints. So Marx kind of says, well, if these things need to be reproduced in order for these relations to stay the same, that is, if supply and demand are ultimately sort of causing all these fluctuations in one or the other in terms of like the relative amounts that we're producing, and then in terms of what people are capable and or willing to exchange one thing for the other, we need to find some basis in which these things are being compared, right? And Marx goes through this process of saying, like, basically that the only thing that's common to these commodities is the labor that's in them. Now, I know the first critique to this is generally going to be that the labor that is within these commodities is in no way uniform. So, for example, if we want to produce A, which has a quality of 5 purple, we might need to fork over, let's try to make this easy, we'll try to make it add up to, let's see, we could do 20 for this guy. So this is 20 hours of labor. And then we'll say this guy takes, if I do, sorry, just doing math in my head. We'll do 40, no, 40 is no good. Let's do, we'll do 30, and then we'll say this guy's 50. So what we can see now is that basically we have these 3 different commodities being produced, and each one is taking disparate quantities of labor. Now, what Marx says initially is that these labors, in terms of the variation between them, are concrete labors. That is to say, this 20 hours that is dedicated to production is dedicated to a certain production of a certain thing. It obviously has certain inputs. Those inputs can also be reduced to labor, but regardless, the actual inputs in terms of either real material cost or in terms of their labor cost is unique in some way to that item. The quantities of those inputs are unique to that item. The processes are unique to that item, the type of labor itself is unique to that item. So all of these labors are concrete labors for the production of that specific commodity. And for the time being, we'll assume that these are averages. It's also true, for example, that in the production, if you have two different producers or something, or even just varying degrees of rates of production among laborers within a single firm, you could obviously have, in a very real sense, one of these commodities only taking 19 hours and another one taking 21 hours. But then on average, it's taking us 20 hours to produce one of these. So there's an average that also occurs in the concrete form. But Marx is noticing something else here. He's saying, well, when we're exchanging these commodities, we're not just exchanging utilities. We're not simply exchanging use values and our preference for one thing over another, or even an equality between one thing. We're also implicitly comparing the labor that went into them. So for example, if we just assume that all of these are produced by individual producers who have a very direct relationship to their labor, the guy who's producing commodity B is going to say, well, I took 30 hours to make this. And if I trade that for commodity A, he doesn't know how much labor necessarily commodity A took. However, because these things have to be reproduced in certain quantities, and because they take a definite amount of time to be reproduced, we are implicitly saying in this exchange that one value or one quantity of concrete labor is equivalent to another. And just like the commodity itself, Marx is saying this is essentially an impossibility. We can't compare concrete labor, right? We can't talk about labor as being equally difficult or requiring equally the same amount of knowledge or being as equally tedious. So because of all these concrete variations between these labors, in order to say that these labors in any way, shape, or form can be equal, we have to come up with a new idea. And this new idea is basically what Marx called abstract labor. So in this one commodity exchange, we have a concept of abstract labor. Now, the measure of abstract labor is something kind of interesting. What we're generally talking about when we talk about abstract labor is this idea that even if certain commodities have different types of labor, different rates of labor, how quickly one produces, different difficulties of labor, all those things, we have to be able to reduce them to this one thing to be able to consider them equal. And again, this is not a conscious reduction. It's not person who trades commodity B for commodity A sitting there and thinking through, well, what would it take me to produce commodity A? It's really completely irrelevant to that. What is relevant here is the fact that these things are considered commensurate in the market. So this concept of abstract labor then is basically an amalgamation of a labor that doesn't actually exist, but a labor that has to exist in order for us to consider these things equal in any sense, especially in the sense of reproduction. That is to say, if we take all these numbers and add them up, we have essentially what amounts to 100 hours worth of labor. If this is the total working time of society, or the total time that society commits to work, this 100 hours could be divided in different ways. So for example, if we decide that instead of only a single A, we want to produce 2 A's, now it takes us 40 hours. Well, if it takes us 40 hours, then that means we have a problem. We can't take 100 hours and then add 40 to this without increasing our 100 hours to 140. So at some point, we have to reorganize labor. We have to change the division of labor into different tasks in order to change the relative quantities or the relative supply of these commodities. So it's this social total that is really making us concerned with the reproduction of commodities in certain quantities, and therefore the levels or the degrees to which these things will exchange, the quantities in which they'll exchange. Now, a few common misconceptions that I want to just sort of dispel out the gate. And I've started with this example very specifically having very different quantities of labor involved in these in order to dispel the notion that Marx believed exchanges occurred based on the equality of this abstract labor, as opposed to on, a sort of marginalist concept of like marginal utility and the supply and demand and all this stuff, right? So Marx is not rejecting the utility aspect. What he is saying is that in order to have these things exchange indefinite quantities and exchange to multiples, we have to be able to compare these things in a way that is quantitatively comparable. And the qualitative differences between these things can't matter. So for example, in this example, we have commodity A and commodity C, which are at opposite ends of this. Now, the only thing we've observed so far is that A trades for B and B would also trade for C. In this sense, we could assume that this is actually two of these guys, and maybe then it's 15 hours. So 2 times 15 for 30 total. So this remains our total social labor. But then 1B trades for 1A, 1B trades for 1C, and everyone's happy, right? But we observe in reality, obviously, that commodities have multiple exchange values. So the first thing that I want to dispel is this idea that exchange value is value. Exchange value for Marx is purely the quantity of one commodity that trades for another. But because one commodity trades with multiple other commodities, a single commodity doesn't have a single exchange value. Rather, a single commodity has multiple exchange values. That is to say, we could also potentially observe 1A trading for 1C. This is going to be a long equals, which I'm hoping doesn't get cut off. Oh god, I'm terrible with this pen. Okay, that's an equals. That's an equals sign. It's just a really long one. While it's also possible, for example, for A to trade for C, through a sort of transitive form, right? You could say, well, I'm going to trade my 1A for 1B because the guy who produced B only wants A, but I want C, and I know C is going to trade for 1B, therefore I can trade, right? It's possible to do this sort of transitive property or transitive aspect of these qualities. However, we do see in reality that one thing trades directly with multiple other things. So there are more than one exchange value. More than one. Now, if there's more than one exchange value, then again, we're only like sort of compounding the effects here, and we're saying that essentially now it's not just the abstract labor that we see sort of forming between 20H and in this case 15H if we take two of those for the total of 30, but it's also this 20H in relation to this 50H, and it's also this 30H or 15H in relation to that. And we can kind of see from this that essentially once we take all the sort of different possible relations and all the different possible exchanges, that what we're getting at is this idea that there's really some basal form of labor that we have to reproduce in order to be able to reproduce these things in definite quantities. In real terms, that would amount to the actual needs of the producers, not just in terms of what they need to be able to survive and continue producing as they are, but also in terms of things like training, right? It would also require, depending on how far into the future we want to project this relationship, the reproduction of new producers, right, to replace the old producers when they pass away. So this basic form of abstract value is really the simplest sort of quantum of labor, if you will, that can then be essentially compounded into more concrete forms of labor. So if we just took a simple example, if I spend 4 years training to be able to do something, the labor that I then am able to perform with that training is different from the labor that I could perform at the beginning of that training. In order to reproduce the concrete labor itself, I had to go through that process of training. And that process of training was labor unto itself, not just in terms of like the amount of time that I spent doing actual learning, but also all the things that went into my training. So that is the labor of professors and teachers, or the labor of tools that I use in the training, or test materials that I use in the training, depending on what I'm producing. So with this sort of quantum understanding of labor, right, where we have a sort of quantum of labor that is essentially the most basic form of labor that can't be divided, we can see that all concrete forms of labor are then essentially just multiples of this magnitude, right? So that 1 hour of one type of labor, one specific type of labor, may actually be more of this abstract labor than is another hour, an exact hour. So if we have 1 hour of labor 1, which is a concrete form of labor, equal to 1 hour of labor 2, or let's say 2 hours of labor 2. We're going to continue with the theme of keeping these things unequal. Then what we would say is basically that 2 hours of labor 2, 1 hour of labor 1 contains essentially twice as much of the abstract labor as 2 hours of labor 1 hour of labor 2 does. I will restate that because I'm a little bit jittery on that. So 1 hour of labor 1 is basically, these are both X labor in the abstract, which for the sake of it, we'll assume that this is like an additional 4 hours or something. So it's like 4 hours of labor in the abstract can produce either 1 hour worth of labor 1 or 2 hours worth of labor 2. So we see kind of like the same exact relationship between use values and their equalities, and the concept of concrete labor and its equality in abstract labor. So again, because we have these multiple actual relations in different quantities of use values, which amount to different quantities of concrete labor, what Marx says is that an exchange value is an expression of this abstract labor. So to say that 1A trades for 1B, which is 20 hours being traded essentially for 30 hours of concrete labor, what we're really saying then is there's something underneath this abstract labor which we call value, or which Marx calls value, and pretty much all Marxists who subscribe to Marx call value. And it's this measure of abstract labor that constitutes the value of the commodity. The exact language that Marx uses is that abstract labor is the substance of value. And that the magnitude of that is something that Marx calls the socially necessary labor time. So there's both a substance and a magnitude. And the magnitude is obviously the measure. So this is our magnitude, but our substance is still this X abstract labor, this weird labor that is common. So I see one question here: is the abstract labor being for significant? Sorry, I missed just an example of two concrete labors made commensurate in the marketplace, right? The abstract labor being for is important in terms of reproduction. That is to say, again, that if these commodities aren't trading ultimately for equal amounts of labor in some basal form, then the reproduction of that commodity doesn't succeed in the future, right? Because no one's really getting what they want or need from society to continue working in whatever field they're doing. So there's an implicit assumption that basically, amongst all this trading, the way that we're actually getting what we want, obviously, is through this trade, but the trade is just a sort of surface level. The trade is a superficial expression of what we're actually doing, which is really dividing up the total labor of society. And that's all the labor of society. It's not just the immediate labor in the production of things, it's also all the labor to reproduce society as a whole, to reproduce the different types of labor of society. This is why, like, you would see distortions when you have not just, certain people that aren't willing to perform a certain type of labor, but also certain people that aren't willing to train a certain type of labor, right? So a shortage in labor is not just not enough people who are skilled in that. It's also a signifier that there's not enough people who are willing to train people to be skilled in that. Or it could be one or the other, right? It could be both. It could be some combination or mix of the two. I guess it could be just one or the other, but which means it's not only the labor itself to produce the commodity that doesn't necessarily want to be done, it could also be the labor to produce the labor. So from Walt is saying, what are the most common objections I hear to abstract value? I don't think that many people actually sort of understand abstract value, or abstract value. So he's using the phrase abstract value, which I haven't really used here. Abstract value is kind of a weird phrase to me, but abstract labor would be the substance of value. Do you want to clarify that, Walt? I mean, I think all value is abstract. Even value in marginalism is abstract, right? There's no concrete objective value to be found in a thing. Like, you can't crack open the thing and find, I discovered its value. I can't put it under a microscope and see how much value it has. Abstract theory of value. I'm still not sure I follow the question. Like, would you consider marginalism an abstract theory of value? I think marginalism relies on a concept of abstract utility. Okay. Walt's been cleaning his car, so I'm gonna take that as a cue to ignore him for now. So this is really the heart of Marx's idea. I want to get into a few specific rebuttals because I think these are probably the most common ones that we hear. So I want to get in first to the idea that there are more inputs into production than just the labor that goes into it. The most common one for that is land, and I think that's mostly because pretty much everyone is. Yeah, so I guess this maybe answers your question, Walt. Is what are the objections? So I'm gonna shift this guy up a little bit just to make some more room. It's gonna take me a bit because this is not an easy process. Okay. So where are we at here? We're gonna talk about land. And forgive me for making circles again. I don't think there's a tool to make squares easily in this drawing program, which is kind of strange. And that is not what I wanted at all, because those should not overlap. Let's do it this way. Okay, let's talk about some land. So these are lands, plots of land. So this is land 1. This is land 2. Land 1 is privately owned. Land 2 is common land. So people will say, okay, yeah, but we observed that land has a price, right? So land has an exchange value. Oh, and just a note on that. Recall that I said exchange values, every commodity has multiple exchange values. Basically, for all the possible commodities for that which that commodity could trade for, there's also one special commodity that constitutes a unique term that we call price. So price in Marxian terms is just exchange value in terms of money. So it's how much of the money commodity will another commodity trade for, is equal to the price. So a lot of people go, oh, well, if this is all true, land has a price, and because it has a price, it's not only like, it's not just a material input into production, it's also cost input into production, right? So let's just imagine the scenario. We have this privately owned land and we have common land, and we have our capitalist guy up here, or I guess rentier class, right, where he has this privately owned land, and then there's a bunch of people that work on this common land, and people don't mind working on the common land. Like, they can produce for themselves, they can subsist off the land, they can grow their own food, herd their own sheep. From the sheep they can cut the wool and make yarn or whatever they could make with it, thread, I guess. Then they can make some cloth with that, make their clothes. So by and large, like, people are okay living on this common land. So there's no real need for them to exchange, right? There's nothing that they want straight out the gate from this privately owned land. But what happens if exchange occurs? Well, the first question is, how much land is going to exchange? And for what? This land is common, which means essentially, if our private owner here wants to go to this land and use that land for whatever he wants to use it for, he could do that. So he doesn't have any different access to the common land than anyone else. He does, however, have control over this private land. And if someone comes over and says, hey, I want to get a piece of your private land here, what is he going to say? Well, he's going to say, I need something for that. That's obvious. It shouldn't be unobvious that someone wants something in exchange for something. That's not necessarily the really weird part about capitalism. It's just the sort of relationships of exchange being as discrete and distinct and definite as they are. So if we look at like historic societies, we see hunter-gatherer societies where there's nominally something that we could call exchange. Like, different people do different types of labor. There's still a division of labor. It's not as developed. There's less division of labor. But there are certain people doing certain things, and they're putting certain products of their labor into this sort of communal total, and then other people are withdrawing those things for use. And, in a way, you can call that exchange. We generally don't, just to distinguish what we're talking about when we talk about an explicit exchange, we generally call that like a gift economy, or maybe like reciprocity, which doesn't have the same sort of confinement as exchange. But in this particular example, he doesn't really have an impetus to do anything for the people on the common land, right? The people on the common land do their own thing. He can do his own thing on the common land. So he has no connection to them other than suddenly in this market exchange where one of these guys walks over and says, hey, I want this piece of land. How much? Now we have a situation where a price needs to be determined. But again, what does he exchange it for? The common land here is not in any way, shape, or form theirs to exchange. And even if they were to exchange just different chunks of land, let's say like all the commoners get together and they say, well, we like this land, right? And maybe that land's preferable for some reason, so we'll give you more of this land down here. And we'll take this out of the commons, and this will become your private land, and this part will become commons, right? Because that says commons, but because this kind of has to be a decision on the regulation of the commons, it doesn't really have too much of an option to become anything but common land, right? Now, if a single producer within the common land comes over, the only thing that he has to afford this land is some measure of his own output, some measure of his own product. So land has a price, but land has a price that can still only be expressed in the labor of the other person's product. So instead of being equal to some other portion of land, what this private owner is going to say is, well, if you want my chunk of land, I need you to trade for me, or trade with me, 5 cattle, 100 bushels of wheat, something like this. And maybe he says, well, I don't want to take it all at once. We'll do like a lease type situation, and you can come take this plot of land and start doing your own stuff on it. But over the course of 5 years, you're going to have to pay me in some measure of the product of your output. In this case, it's pretty clear to see that the price of land is still only an expression of labor. And if the price of land is still only an expression of labor, in order for land to continue having that price, we still have to be able to reproduce these labors, right? So we still come back down to this idea of abstract value. And therefore, in Marx's whole concept of this system, because commodities become the way in which we sort of produce and reproduce society, and commodity exchange becomes the dominant force in the reproduction of society, we're still ultimately talking about things being valued in terms of labor. The only difference is, instead of those commodities that he's producing being exchanged for other commodities, again, being fungible goods, instead of those commodities being produced for other commodities, he's exchanging them for land. So in Marx's view, when you do this exchange for land, what you're really doing is you're sort of taking a portion of the value, you're taking a portion of the abstract labor of society out of the general reproduction of the sort of commodity market. And this is why, if you go up to his whole concept of how profits get distributed, if you have a particular type of production that requires a lot of land, and someone privately owns that land and leases it out to the producer, that producer has to be able to produce enough value on top of, that is in addition to his immediate costs, from which that land can be compensated, or the price of that land can be compensated. So in Marx's view, this price of land or this price of rents in any form, and for that matter interest or anything of that nature, are necessarily still subtractions from the total value that's being produced by society. They're just not going back into the commodity reproduction. This is probably where we get the idea that like people who rent stuff is, parasitic in a way, right? They're not really expanding society in any way. They're not expanding our capacity to take those things and then produce them in something else. And it's not like, yes, they may be maintaining the land, or they may be putting some into it. I know people talk about like landlords and they go, oh yeah, well, the landlord doesn't do anything. Like obviously the landlord has costs to upkeep the property. But that's not really the concern. That does reproduce a portion. So maybe some of that then becomes a sort of productive labor in itself, but that quantity that actually relates to the land and the land itself is just completely ineffectual, right? The land has always been there. The land is provided by nature. There's no cost initially to the land and the land itself. The only cost that you can make on land that would actually be a quantity of labor bestowed on the land is obviously laboring to improve the land, which in terms of Marxist theory would count as some sort of labor. That is to say, if we reproduced land for a certain use, then we have a qualitatively different use value and concrete labor. So we have all the makings of a commodity there. So it's not the land in and of itself, but rather the sort of the transformation of the land that becomes the commodity in that sense. So that's generally the major objection is other inputs. And if we look at this, I think it's fairly clear to see why other inputs are still valued with respect to abstract labor. Does anyone have any other questions at this point? Let me go check Reddit, because I did post this on Reddit. We'll see if there's any questions there. I don't have any questions on Reddit, so... okay, well, maybe let's just go into a couple other things, because I guess... Oh, wait, we do have a question now. Okay, so this is a refutation of the pro-capitalist labor can't be the common factor in producing a commodity argument. So even land is expressed with labor when exchanged, basically it. Yeah, I mean, you can reduce it in that way. I mean, I don't know that I would want to say that I mean, the question is, what is the price of land, right? That's the ultimate question. If the idea is that labor can't be the only common factor in producing, it's not the only common factor in producing the commodity. It's the question of land having a price, right? And it's a question of land contributing to cost of production, right? So their basic idea is that land has to contribute to cost of production, but the guy already owns the land, right? He's not losing the land by renting it to you. Or if he owns the land, he doesn't lose the land in any way, shape, or form. Now, he may have, again, some sort of maintenance cost, where if, let's say that the production that you're doing on the land puts the land in a certain state, and he's not going to be ultimately happy with that state, so he's charging you a rent in accordance with, what he's going to need to do at the end of this production period, or however many production periods you go over. He could be charging you the amount that he believes he's going to have to then in turn exchange to recoup the land in a usable state for him, which would obviously require labor. It might require someone to come in and till the soil, turn over the topsoil, add some fertilizer. Maybe he's using it for a different type of production later, or maybe whatever production you do, puts a bunch of buildings on the land, and he has no use for those buildings at the end, so then he has to have them come in and demolish and clear it off the land in order to use it for he wants to use it for. So there's other relations, but ultimately what constitutes the price of land has to be in one form or another an expression of labor. The only society... So let me add a caveat to that to say that the only society where you could imagine potentially land to be a basis for value, or even a component of value, would have to be one that is massively agrarian with private ownership, right? And essentially, rather than trading products of labor for land, people are just trading different plots of land, right? So you could imagine a society like that. But Marx's argument would be essentially then all you've done is essentially you've imagined capitalism away at that point. You're not talking about capitalism as a mode of production anymore. So since Marx's value theory deals with capitalism as it actually exists, he's not talking about a society where people are just trading different plots of land in different proportion to one another based on the concrete use values of the land. And maybe Marx would have a land theory of value for such a society, but that's not the society that we exist in. It's not the society we live in. I would say that, you may find cases at the margins for something like that, where, let's say you were going to trade one piece of land for another, and someone found the utility of your land sufficiently preferable to the utility of their own land, and you found the utility of their land sufficiently preferable to the utility of your own land. And at the end of the day, like, you believe that whatever that utility would provide you would be a better way to convert or get access to the utility of that land rather than trying to convert your own land, right? You could definitely have a cost to qualitatively changing your own land, such as to kind of push you into that sort of exchange. But I don't know that, I don't know how many exchanges like that actually happen. I would say that even if that was the case, like, people would still value the land in relation to other market terms. Like, if I was going to sell my land and some guy came to me and said, hey, I don't want to give you money, I want to trade my land, I mean, what's the first thing I would do? I would go up and look at essentially how much his land is worth, right? And then I would put it in money terms. And then I would say, okay, well, your land in terms of money is this much, and my land in terms of money is this much. So why wouldn't I, let's say, his land is $10,000 in terms of money, and my land is $20,000 in money. I'm not going to trade my $20,000 in land for his land when I could just trade my land for $20,000, use $10,000 of it to buy his land, or even offer him higher than the market rate to guarantee my getting it, right? And then still have money left over. Like, it doesn't make any sense. So ultimately, like, all these price expressions and all these cost expressions into production are still always terms or presented in terms of abstract labor. I hope that answered the question. So, just to cover the sort of final basics, and this is not something necessarily that Marx really gets into in chapter 1 so much, but just covering the basics of, like, what surplus value is. And the only reason I'm really, like, making this point in this primer is because this is generally what we hear. When people take issue with the term exploitation, they don't really understand what that means. So in Marx's concept, we've sort of gone over why everything is essentially, like, costs are reduced to some measure of abstract labor in the system of generalized commodity exchange. So if we have Marx's basic formula for value, which he divides into 3 parts. This is a capital V, so we'll distinguish that from the rest. So this is basically our fixed capital inputs. And again, part of this could be land. But it doesn't matter, because that land still finds its expression in the value form in terms of abstract labor. Abstract labor. Also forgive my terrible handwriting. This is our variable capital. I mean, technically both of these constitute a larger capital, but let me split this into. You may also sometimes see this just expressed as wages. So variable equals wages. Capital, since it is also a measure of abstract labor, it's dead labor. What does that mean? Okay, so because capital is still reducible to abstract labor in terms of like whether it's a machine or raw materials that were harvested from land or mined from mines and still constitute some measure of labor, it's dead labor because it is no longer able to transform its qualitative aspects, right? So a big component of what you'll tend to see in Marx is this idea that things have this sort of like qualitative quantitative relationship, right? And there's a certain quantity of labor that goes into transforming the qualitative aspects of a good. Production itself is this process, right? So we commit a quantity of labor which itself has qualitative aspects, and therefore itself has a quantitative sort of abstraction. We commit all those things, and in doing so, we change the actual qualitative output. So I take a piece of metal and I heat it up and I hammer on it with my hammer on my anvil, and I produce a knife, right? I've changed it from a dull piece of metal, perhaps a non-hardened or too brittle piece of metal, whatever it happens to be. In this process of forging the knife, I have changed the qualitative aspects of, even if the knife is all metal, right? I've changed the qualities of it. It's now not just a piece of metal, it's a knife. A knife is also a piece of metal. So there's certain qualitative aspects that remain, right? It may still have some of the same qualitative properties as the iron and the carbon that went into it, to this in a way that it could be deconstructed later. But even to deconstruct it, to then change it back down to just those qualitative properties, I would have to add more labor. So this is a process here where we're taking something that is qualitatively fixed, this capital. We're adding to it variable capital, or what Marx calls living labor, which also has a definite quality, but has something of a flexible quantity. That is, we can speed up production, right? Because the labor is in the active process of doing what it's doing, we can change certain things about it. And by speeding up production, we can produce more things in less time. This final aspect of this particular equation is what Marx calls surplus. Or surplus value. I'm not going to say surplus value at this point. We'll just call it surplus labor. So we'll call it surplus labor. So what does Marx mean by surplus labor? Well, remember we're talking about a system of reproduction here, right? We're talking about a process wherein over the course of multiple periods of production, the varying quantities and levels of commodities and things like that have to be reproduced in certain specific proportions in order to relate to one another in these terms of prices, in order to fulfill, I don't want to say fulfill the needs of, but at least to reach a level of preference selection wherein we reproduce enough of this abstract labor in order to create the necessary concrete labors in all their necessary concrete forms, in order to create all the concrete use values in their concrete forms, in order to do it all over again, right? And what Marx's basic premise is that the amount of labor that it takes to reproduce that is less than the amount of labor than the total labor of society in any given production cycle. So I don't want to scroll all the way back up because it'll take me forever. But in our previous example, we had the three commodities, and I think we had a 20 hours, a 30 hours, and a 50 hours, and that was equal to 100 hours of total social labor, right? this 100 hours of total social labor has to be divided in certain ways in order to reproduce this indefinitely. Now, obviously, like, people's preferences change, and the amount of labor that we want to commit to one thing or another changes. So the ways in which all these relations exist change over time, which means that we're never reproducing the exact same conditions. But in order to have any concept of growth or material expansion, we necessarily have to be producing, or even abstract expansion in terms of value, or in terms of like money or utility, anything of that nature. We have to change the relations of production and recommit certain quantities of labor to other things. If we don't produce enough to compel people to go back to work, if we don't produce enough to convince people that doing what they're doing is worth it, then they won't do it. So there's a basic material reality that we have to produce certain things in certain quantities in order to just convince everyone to do it again. But above and beyond that, for the individual laborer, we can see that the only thing we have to convince them of is really the basis of what they want to work as an individual. So whatever they think their sort of concrete labor is worth to them, we could talk about this in subjective terms. We could talk about it in their subjective preferences. Would I rather go to work for this boss who, makes fun of me all day and treats me like garbage? Or would I rather stay home? Well, I need money to buy XYZ, and I can't find another job right now. So, yeah, ultimately in the end, no matter how poorly they treat you, if you return to work, you can always say that was their preference. You can always say they found it preferable to go work for this guy rather than do anything else. That's always been a tautological statement, right? That's always been obvious. It's so obvious that we just don't think it's worthy of spending time talking about it. That's kind of Marx's assessment. But yet we see like the neoclassical model and the marginalists, and this is all they want to talk about, is like preference expression. And it's just not a particularly useful question for how a society is materially reproducing itself. So going back to this 100 hours of labor thing here. So what Marx is basically saying with exploitation is that the amount of value, or the amount of labor, even the amount of abstract labor that's necessary to convince someone to return to work, is less than the amount of labor that you actually require them to perform in order to receive that. So what we're really looking at is a distinction that Marx makes between labor and labor power. So when Marx talks about the labor of a worker, he might be talking about 40 hours a week. When Marx talks about his labor power, he's talking about his ability plus willingness to work 40 hours a week. So his ability and his willingness is not the same as the labor in and of itself. And it in itself has its own cost. I'm going to scroll this up real quick. The cost of this labor power is what Marx calls the variable capital, or wages. So it's a portion of the existing capital that has been built up, and you could talk about it in terms of material goods. You don't have to talk about it in terms of abstract value. You don't have to talk about it in terms of money. You could talk about it in terms of real material goods. It's a portion of the qualitative products of society, the concrete use values, that has already been produced, that is essentially, one way or another, either directly or through the medium of exchange of money, is given to the laborer to, one, reproduce their labor in the pure biological sense, right? That is, to give them enough energy to come back and to work as hard as they need to work, or as fast as they need to work, to keep them alive while they need to work, to keep them sheltered so that they don't get sick, so that they don't have to take 3 days off next week. This is a core basic function of the cost of labor power, is to actually give the worker what they need in order to return to work. But that's just the immediate question. There's also this longer term question of what happens when that labor finally breaks down and dies. And Marx says, for this, a portion of the wages, a portion of the variable capital, one of the costs of labor power, is also the additional cost of reproducing the labor power in the long term, right? Because you have to raise children and rear children. And he's not saying like this is every family just raises their kids to do exactly the same job they did. He's talking about this at a large aggregate scale of society. So no matter where you look at this value equation, right? You can always relate it back to the totality of society. It's just, if this is individual, then you just take one of these for every individual and you add up all its constituent parts, and you have the aggregate parts for capital, the aggregate parts for value, and the aggregate parts for surplus. So there's the cost of reproducing the labor in the immediate term. There's the cost of reproducing the labor in the long term. And then there's also, lastly, what Marx calls a moral component of wages, which is basically what's the worker willing to put up with based on social standards and expectations of like culture of work and things like that. And this isn't because Marx is not looking at the cost of labor power as strictly the biological reproduction or the physical material reproduction. It's also the reproduction, again, of the worker's willingness to come to work. And that's a moral consideration, which the worker looks at the rest of society and goes, well, if I'm treated this way over here, and I can go get another job over there where I'm treated better, like maybe I'll accept less money because I'm treated better, right? So they start to think even the concrete sort of things that we talk about in terms of our work environment can be expressed oftentimes in terms of money, or in terms of abstract labor, right? Because ultimately money just affords us some measure of other labor. That's the whole point of it. So money in itself isn't really useful. So what Marx is basically saying is that the total labor cost of all these things added up, the immediate needs, the long-term needs of reproduction, of purely physical reproduction, the moral cost of labor, all of these things added up is less than what the worker has to work to get them. So if the worker has to labor 40 hours, what Marx is saying is he works for 40 hours, but his wages might be equivalent to, actually, let's turn this into an at symbol. 40 hours at, let's say, this is just a totally made up number, but let's say 0.75 hours per hour. That is to say, for an hour of labor, the cost of that labor power, the cost of that person's ability and willingness to work for that hour is only 3/4 of that amount of time. That means it's the necessary labor that went into producing the food, that went into producing his housing, or at least a portion thereof, as it depreciates over time and degrades over time. The cost that goes into his general entertainment for his own sanity. So that could include anything from, the costs of public parks to the cost of state subsidized medical care. It doesn't matter where these components necessarily come from. What matters is that the labor sees that by going to work, he's reproducing this condition which affords him the ability and willingness to go back. And insofar as this number is less than 1 hour per hour, then the worker is actually producing, in this case, 40 hours worth of product in only 30 hours, basically. Like, his cost is 30 hours, and he's producing something for 40 hours. That gives us 10 surplus. So, going back to our original equation, if we're just talking the individual, we have our V at 40 hours. Sorry, we have our V at 30 hours. That's our cost. We have our surplus is 10. Capital doesn't really matter right now. C, X, whatever. Let me actually do that. Let's just call it C. So if all we did was give back to society these two components, there would be no growth, right? We would only reproduce the existing conditions at best. It's only by adding this 10 that we have expanded productive forces. I'm going to interject here with a pretty common rebuttal to this concept, and that is basically the idea of, well, it's not labor, it's technology, stupid. Of course, Marx doesn't really refute that technology is a huge aspect of this. Let's say that I have an apple. One apple. And I have a couple options. I can eat this apple. I can plant this apple. Let's assume that the soil doesn't have enough nutrients in it, and I have to plant the whole apple or something like that to grow the apple. Obviously, if I consume the apple, and I don't plant the apple, and I don't have any other way of getting apples, like they're not reproduced naturally, then I die. I die in a later production cycle. If I plant the apple and I don't eat the apple, then I probably die a lot quicker, right? This is a basic state where there's no possible way to reproduce my own labor, but also reproduce essentially the means of what I need to actually do the function. So Marx has a basic idea that the way that different modes of production come about is through the expansion of these surpluses. So we kind of start off with, like, we have an unknown starting point, right? At some point we were, at least biologically, evolutionarily, some kind of different species. How we went about reproducing ourselves as a species prior to this sort of point of conscious laboring is not really of our concern. What we know is that we sort of enter into the world as conscious thinking beings at some point, and we already have a definite way of reproducing ourselves. And up until that point, we are essentially like any other animal in that we sort of reproduce ourselves in this natural equilibrium state. We don't take over the entire globe per se. The extent to which we sort of impact our environment is pretty limited. It's not to say we can't do more or less, but it's to say that our reproduction is essentially instinctual, right? And if our species evolutionarily produced a bunch of surplus and ate itself to early disease, historically, then we probably wouldn't be here. So our bodies kind of solve this problem of this sort of equilibrium regulation with nature, and how different things affect us in nature. But once we enter into conscious production, that is, once we're aware that we're producing, and once the first kind of thought can pop into a human mind to say, hey, I'm not out of energy, I could work a little bit longer, right? So I have the ability to work longer, but I haven't been working longer. So I've obviously have this surplus labor, or this ability of surplus labor, that I can practice, and I can make surpluses from that labor to then use later, or to secure myself against possible detrimental states of affairs in nature. So if there's a famine, maybe I have additional food stock. It's that surplus labor, and that sort of comes about initially through conscious production, where people are really thinking about it, like, oh, I'm producing more, that we see expressed in this thing. So we're not saying capitalism in this material sense is any different, right? We've always essentially had some level of surpluses. What we do know, however, is that in order for technology to arise, that is, in order for us to discover a new way of developing something, in order for us to build a machine to do something in a new way, faster, to compound our labor, to make our labor more productive, we have to still take a portion of that surplus labor and commit it to that thing. Because we can't get around the fact that we always have to pay back the cost of labor. We always have to, at least at the bare minimum materially, reproduce our ability to labor. If we don't do that, we're done. We're done as a species, right? So at some point, when we start into this process of conscious production, and we start to recognize that we have this surplus labor, we can devote that to these discoveries. We can devote that to these developments of new technologies, new processes of production, sharing knowledge, all these sorts of things, which then compound over time. Capitalism, coming on the scene much later, seems to be a little bit different than historic societies in that the technological process seems so vast, progress rather, seems so vast. And when Marx examines sort of the historic idea of surpluses and what surpluses led to, and then you look at surpluses in modern day times, if we take what I just got done explaining, which is that essentially the technological progress in itself is not merely the cause of surplus, but is necessarily caused by surplus, then the obvious conclusion from that should be that capitalism as a form of society is one that has generated massive surpluses. The question then is, if we're generating massive surpluses, what proportion of those surpluses are going where? Who's making these decisions? Who expropriates the surplus? And that's where we get into sort of this concept of exploitation theory. It's not that capitalism is unique in producing surpluses, it's that capitalism is unique in the relation of production itself, such that the way those surpluses are expropriated and directed towards different use is different than historic societies. The way those surpluses, or the impetus for those surpluses, is different from historic societies. At some point prior to the development of all this commerce and this global scale of social production, we lived in smaller tribes where the most we could imagine is having like such a surplus of food that we just didn't have to worry about food for some time. That is still a very different type of surplus than is surplus for surplus sake, which is what we see under capitalism, right? What we see is the generation of surpluses in order to produce more surpluses. And this comes about through this entire abstraction between concrete use values and concrete labors and these abstract forms of it. So the further abstracted we get, and again, I want to be clear, like this abstraction it's not just a mental game, right? Marx is saying this abstraction is a real process. Like we're actually changing in the way these commodities compare to one another. We're actually changing the way society itself relates down the line. So this leads to things like commodity fetishism in Marxist theory. It leads to obviously like estranged labor and things like that. And that all comes back into this giant feedback loop that is the economy and starts to transform the relations of production itself into something totally new and unique. I'm going to pretty much leave it there because I think I covered like all the basics of like the theory. I actually went beyond what I wanted to talk about and got into exploitation and surplus value and stuff like that. Are there any final questions from the chat? I'm going to check Reddit one more time. But any final questions from the chat? I don't see any. There's only 2 concurrent users, so I'm guessing we don't have a big following, but that's okay. I hope that helped as an introduction. Probably not as cohesive or coherent as I imagined it in my head, but I did see one thing. It said message retracted, but I'll respond to it. But the question was regards to labor power itself. But yes, in Marxist theory, labor power itself is a commodity. So labor power itself has its own abstract value that is independent from the value that it actually affords the laborer to produce. And that's basically the root of exploitation, is the difference between the time that the labor can produce and the time it took to produce the things to produce the time the labor could produce. Okay, well, thanks everyone for watching. If you do have any follow-up questions, I think everyone either got here through Discord or through Reddit itself. In all those places, I did post a link to the Reddit thread. Feel free to throw any questions or follow-up questions you have on the Reddit thread, and I'll answer those there. Outside of that, thanks for watching, and I hope it was at least a little bit informative. Have a good evening.